Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. Today I'm covering Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful and A Pal for Gary. Bruh, can I get a break for like 1 second? I guess not. Well, anyway, what's a connecting thread between these episodes? Is there a connecting thread? Other than SpongeBob appearing, of course. That doesn't even count. Uh, I guess both of these episodes feature a rivalry of some kind? Kind of, at least. Listen, I'm grasping at straws here. Let me have this. Well, anyway. As always, gotta say thank you to everyone watching today. Your viewership is, like always, very appreciated. Love y'all lots. And now, let's just get right into it. When, oh when, will Squilliam return from war? Well, I heard that he was in a season 15 episode, but he didn't speak then, I don't think, so I still think that this opening sentence applies. This episode, Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful, is the last time we get Squilliam Fancyson in a major-ish role. It's not the last time we see him, before season 15 I guess, that honor goes to Back to the Past, but his role is very minor there. And he does appear in a gag in the season 10 episode Code Yellow, but, like, that doesn't count to me. Alright, that's enough about Squilliam. Thinking about Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful more generally now, this is an episode that I think seems to be viewed a bit more on the negative side. At least that's the impression I've gathered from my experience over the years. Generally, this episode isn't talked about very much anyway, so it's kinda hard to get a pulse on what the fanbase thinks of it. We begin with Squidward just vibing and enjoying his walk. Until he steps on some chewing gum, which is so nasty, like, gross. It's like The Gift of Gum Part 2 for Squidward here, as he gets himself covered in the sticky substance, which is a treat for us since this sequence involves some pretty fun visuals, making it really enjoyable. And then Squidward proves himself to be a real hypocrite, talking shit about litterers before littering himself, and as we all know from episodes like SpongeBob Meets the Strangler, in Bikini Bottom, if you litter, you're gonna get the full hammer of the law brought down on your ass. And this is of course exactly what happens to Squidward here, who throws the piece of gum directly in front of a cop. Have some situational awareness, Squidward, come on, man. Anyway, Squidward gets sentenced to community service because of his littering ways, and this is what brings Squilliam into the episode. I love Squilliam and Squidward's rivalry, it's always hilarious, and I love how this episode really leans into the competition between them. The way Squidward fully just trips a child to steal their wagon is so awful yet so funny. And then we get a surprise SpongeBob appearance. Kind of, at least. He did appear briefly at the beginning of the episode, as he offers to help Squidward out with his community service. I love how SpongeBob is just randomly studying the complete life cycle of a Krabby Patty, like that is the kind of obsessive behavior that I like to see from him. And then I love that Squidward ends up getting his universal justice when the mother of the kid whose wagon he stole beats his ass, as she should. The way the cop keeps showing up just to make Squidward's life worse is pretty funny too. Squidward eventually allows SpongeBob to help him out, since things are going pretty shitty without him, and I love how Squidward's like, I hate you a little less now. And I love that SpongeBob takes this line for such a glowing compliment, because coming from Squidward, it kinda is. And also, SpongeBob's infectious optimism is always a welcome element of his character. I also really like how the episode goes about the reveal of how SpongeBob quote-unquote helped Squidward here. Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful leaves us in suspense by not answering that question immediately, and it takes its time in showing Squidward's house. But once the camera pans over and we see Squidward's house, we know exactly just what went on here. And Squidward's obliviousness to this is hilarious. Honestly, this is all rather impressive of SpongeBob to make a full replica of Squidward's house using trash. Seems like he's using those interior design skills from Squid's visit. Once Squidward realizes what's happened, his reaction is hilarious, and the cop's continued appearance is also just so funny, such a good running gag. Squidward's complete inability to win with this guy is absolutely hysterical. At first I thought it might get annoying, but it never did. SpongeBob making a statue of Squidward out of garbage is both funny and wholesome, and then Squilliam comes back, and honestly, I'm just shocked he said SpongeBob. It's weird coming from him. But Squilliam's reappearance also marks the end of this episode, where Squilliam finally gets his brand of universal justice, and Squidward gets to have the last laugh. But then everyone ends up getting littering tickets, and I love it. Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful was just a very enjoyable episode for me. That's all there is to it. The running gag with the cop was great, and all of the other humor in this episode is also pretty good. Also, I just really liked the art in this episode, like the drawing style, like, very round and silly. I also really loved seeing Squilliam again, even though I wish he did more in this episode. But yeah, nothing at all really to complain about here. So this episode is going in my amazing tier, where it comes in with a score of 9.3 out of 10. Oh dear, this isn't good at all. No, no, not good at all. Alright, season 7. Can you chill for like 2 seconds? Please? Pretty please? For me? Because why have I just gotten finished reviewing my most hated episode in this show, and then another episode that I can't stand, and now I'm right here reviewing my second most hated episode? Yeah, this is a pal for Gary. I doubt that my hatred of this episode comes as a surprise, given that I'm the CEO of Gary the Snail and all, and for once I'm right alongside the popular opinion on this one. A Pal for Gary is one of the 2 episodes in this show that are considered the worst of the entire series. I'm sure you can guess which episode the other one might be. Now, when I say I'm standing alongside popular opinion, I still need y'all to know that I understand that the problems in this episode are not worth getting legitimately angry over, but my general sentiment is the same. What's so especially heinous about this episode, and yes, I recognize I just referenced Law and Order, is how the beginning of this one really draws in viewers like me who are longing for some SpongeBob and Gary content. The first minute or so of A Pal for Gary is actually pretty good, like, no lie. I love how SpongeBob clearly cares for Gary and how it hurts to leave Gary alone, and I love Gary's hobby of watching old westerns. These 2 things are a great foundation upon which to build this episode. A Pal for Gary continues to be entertaining when we cut to SpongeBob working at the Krusty Krab, and how he increasingly feels worried and guilty about Gary. And then when SpongeBob leaves and is caught by Mr. Krabs, this part is great too. This all really makes me start to wonder if I perhaps misjudged this episode, because clearly things are going great, and not especially indicative of an episode that's going to be shit. Of course, just like every other disappointing Gary episode, I start out this episode with a glimmer of hope that I'll finally get the Gary-focused masterpiece that I'm looking for. It won't be long now until this episode crushes that hope thoroughly. So basically, unlike Stuck in the Ringer, this episode has actual potential, and this is why a lot of my displeasure with this episode stems from disappointment, rather than just disliking it. But to be clear, I do dislike this episode a lot too, don't get it twisted. Speaking of these first few minutes of foundational setup for this episode, when you really think about it, the direction that A Pal for Gary opts to go in doesn't really make a lot of sense. At least, it doesn't to me, and maybe this comes from having hindsight about how shit the episode ends up being. Like, the premise here is that SpongeBob feels bad about leaving Gary alone, that he is the one leaving Gary alone. So, getting Gary a companion doesn't particularly follow from that premise to me. Now, it makes enough sense, like, I'm slightly exaggerating. I can follow the logic, it's a simple solution to the problem, but the episode itself does not establish this as a solution until relatively late in the game. Instead, the implication is more that SpongeBob himself needs to be there for Gary. At least that's what I take away from these first few minutes. This is a nitpick beyond belief, but hey, I'm allowed to do what I want. I also mention all of this because the episode going with this plot, SpongeBob trying to make more time for Gary, or maybe bringing the Gary to work with him, would have been a lot better than what we got. But again, hindsight is 2020. Moving on from these musings about this episode's direction, the fact is that A Pal for Gary goes this route of introducing, well, A Pal for Gary. The best I can say about this story beat is that it does make the episode go in a different and rather unexpected direction. Maybe this is because I've never watched Gremlins, but I was not really thinking cute pet will turn out to be a literal horrifying monster, so there's that. Also, the fact that Puffy Fluffy does end up being a monster makes me ask a lot of questions about the father and son who'd bought one before SpongeBob. Hopefully they're okay. And then one more thing that is definitely a short tangent this time, but did anyone watching this video play on the Moshi Monsters website? Cause I did, and the members of Puffy Fluffy's species all look like glumps to me. Good times. Once SpongeBob takes Puffy Fluffy, I can already feel myself growing annoyed because of how SpongeBob ignores the very obvious warnings and signs from the shop owner. It's here that I'm seeing another missed opportunity in this episode, making SpongeBob's obliviousness an actual issue that the plot addresses at some point, ideally the climax, because let's think about this for a second. SpongeBob thinks that he's doing a bad thing by leaving Gary alone, despite the fact that Gary seems to do just fine on his own. Assumedly, SpongeBob never asks Gary about how he feels about being left alone all day. It certainly doesn't happen on screen, at least. If a pal for Gary had wanted to make SpongeBob's obliviousness a real blatant trend, it could have shown Gary trying to tell SpongeBob that he's perfectly fine alone, and SpongeBob ignores this or misconstrues this in favor of thinking that he knows what's best for Gary. This right here would make the notorious last third of this episode make a lot more sense at the very least, and this would also require that SpongeBob learn his lesson and make a proper apology towards Gary. If his obliviousness is made the point of the episode at least, and see, if we did get that proper apology, my enjoyment of this episode would improve exponentially, although I would still generally dislike it unless more significant changes were made, but at least this idea that I just came up with here would give A Pal for Gary a more fitting direction. Back to what actually happens in the episode now. It's once SpongeBob returns to his pineapple with Puffy Fluffy that A Pal for Gary decides to completely give up on making SpongeBob a likable character, and on making watching this episode an enjoyable use of my time. SpongeBob is completely oblivious to how Puffy Fluffy is treating Gary, horribly if you need a reminder, and I can tell that this is meant to be comedic, but there is no comedy here. I don't even know what I'm supposed to laugh at, to be honest, because Gary has done nothing to deserve this shitty treatment, and the way that this is coupled with SpongeBob acting like an asshole to Gary in general, just like in Pet or Pest, really begins to shift my annoyance to true irritation and perhaps infuriation. Also, the whole part where SpongeBob makes Gary share with Puffy Fluffy makes no fucking sense whatsoever and just makes him look like an awful pet owner. Why would he give Gary the same amount of food as always and then expect him to share? This episode gives extreme whiplash for how good of a pet owner SpongeBob is, and I hate it. How does he start off perfectly fine and then become so supremely awful? Once we see that Puffy Fluffy is purposefully tricking SpongeBob into thinking that it's innocent while Gary isn't, the direction that this episode is going in becomes much clearer, and I hate it. These kinds of plots, a kind of Cassandra truth plot, TV tropes page in the description if you need it, I cannot stand them. Top 5 worst tropes of all time because they are so far beyond frustrating. For the sake of time and my patience, I won't sit here and go through every repetitive iteration of this godforsaken trope in the plot of this episode, because, yeah, this episode is also just extremely repetitive during this segment of it. Like, we fucking get it, oh my god. Just know that every time SpongeBob is an oblivious asshat, I'm angry. Got it? Good. When Puffy Fluffy goes full monster mode, I'm struck by yet another idea that would have made this episode even better, and it's my favorite kind of idea too, using some horror. Just walk with me. A Pal for Gary begins the same way, except SpongeBob actually does have a conversation with Gary about what he perceives to be loneliness in the snail, and he decides to override Gary's desires by getting a second pet as a companion. SpongeBob goes and gets Puffy Fluffy, but instead of a shop, he finds Puffy Fluffy out in the wild or something, looking cute. He goes to pick up Puffy Fluffy, and boom, he turns into a monster, and we cut away, only hearing SpongeBob scream when the episode goes back to Gary. Some time passes, and Gary's like, hey, wait, where's SpongeBob? So he decides to investigate. We get some fun antics with this until he eventually finds Puffy Fluffy's lair, where he sees SpongeBob. He saves the day, of course, using those old Western skills established in the beginning of the episode, and SpongeBob is apologetic for not listening to Gary, and grateful that Gary saved him. Is that not far better? Unfortunately, that isn't what happens, and now I have to return to what actually does happen in A Pal for Gary. I will say that Puffy Fluffy's monster design is cool at least, and seeing Gary try and fight back against this thing is entertaining enough. I love how defensive he gets once Puffy Fluffy starts tearing SpongeBob's clothes, because he clearly loves SpongeBob, and I'm glad that this episode isn't boring at least, but poor Gary deals with this all night, and somehow SpongeBob doesn't even wake up to it at all, and then when SpongeBob does finally wake up and sees the damage, he immediately blames Gary, and man, all the goodwill that I had been building towards this episode goes away just like that. Because are you serious? But that's not even the worst part. No, the worst part of this episode is everything that comes once SpongeBob opens the door. Instead of defending his snail against the giant monster literally trying to eat him right that second, SpongeBob berates Gary because he thinks that Gary's attacking Puffy Fluffy. What? What? How does that even remotely make any sense at all? In what world can SpongeBob walk into this scene and think Gary is the one causing this mess? If the point was that SpongeBob is mixing up Gary and Puffy Fluffy, they should have made their designs similar, but I don't think that was the point at all because them looking alike had never been brought up at any point during this episode's runtime. A halfway decent episode would have had SpongeBob realize the error of his ways right here. The episode would still be awful, but it would be redeemable. But this episode decides to have SpongeBob SpongeBob be 10 times worse, and for what? And we're meant to find this funny. That's the whole reason the fake out was done, because this is supposed to be humorous. Well, let me break it to whoever thought this was a good idea. This is not funny. At all. It's just beyond infuriating. And then Gary, being the king he is, saves the day when Puffy Fluffy starts trying to eat SpongeBob. We get a nice callback to all the westerns Gary had been watching before, so this was nice to see, and it was a decently entertaining action sequence. What is not nice to see is SpongeBob immediately running after Puffy Fluffy and then being angry at Gary for driving Puffy Fluffy away, as if SpongeBob couldn't realize he was literally being eaten. The very end of this episode actually would have been good if it was in a different episode, because SpongeBob bringing Gary to work is actually fun, and Mr. Krabs is pretty funny here. But it leaves a bad taste in my mouth that after all the hell SpongeBob just put Gary through, from which he never learned, he is now forcing Gary out of his comfortable days spent at home and into free labor? No wonder Gary looks so completely done at the end of the episode. I enjoy a long-suffering character like Squidward, but this is beyond ridiculous. A Pal for Gary is both better and worse than I remember. Worse in that I forgot how much missed potential there was in this episode, and how much actually good stuff was here that was completely thrown to the wayside. It's almost impressive how, whenever this episode had to choose between being good/decent and utter dog shit, it chose the latter. It would have been so easy for this episode to be good. That's why it was so easy for me to come up with improved versions of it. And I think that's why I regard this episode as my second least favorite, at least in this moment, but this is unlikely to change. A Pal for Gary is not the least enjoyable episode I've ever seen, and there are some episodes I dislike more than it in some ways. Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy definitely pissed me off more, for example. But never before have I seen an episode so completely sabotage itself when it had such a strong footing. I can't understand it. And so all of this is why this episode is being placed in my abysmal tier, where it comes in with the second lowest score so far, a 1 out of 10. As always, I'll be ending this review with some closing thoughts of mine. Yeah, I had to give an episode some lashings again. Season 7 just keeps them coming. I think this might be it for a bit. I don't know, and I mean that, I really don't. I could look at the list of Season 7 episodes right now, but I'll let myself, and y'all, unless you remember the order of Season 7 episodes, of course, live in suspense. I feel bad that Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful has been so overshadowed here. I mean, not just by my thoughts towards A Pal for Gary, but by the infamy of this episode in general. I elected not to spend too much time talking about this during the review, but for those of y'all not familiar with the landscape of SpongeBob reviewing and fandom thought from the 2010s and beyond, I want y'all to understand how much of a big deal this episode is. Like, the title of worst episode in the show is not one I use lightly. People were calling it that for years and years and years, and they still call it that now. Seriously, just search up this episode right here on YouTube, you'll see what I mean real quick. I just did that myself, and it's kind of funny to see what pops up. What's really funny is that there's one episode that somehow has an even worse reputation than this one, and I can think of a few reasons as to why that episode managed to garner such a more abysmal reputation despite, potentially, not being as bad as A Pal for Gary. You can consider that as spoilery of an indication of my thoughts on One Course Meal as you're gonna get until I get to that episode, which will be soon enough, I'm sure. Alright, I'm wrapping this up now. I've got nothing left to say but more irrelevant yapping, and so I'm gonna close things here, and I'll see you all in the next review.